All right, welcome back to U.S. history. We're going to pick up here with Roman numeral 4, the Eisenhower and Kennedy eras, and we're kind of just going to highlight some major things so I can get to the meat of what I really want to talk about. And so let's go ahead and detail Dwight Eisenhower's presidency and his response to communism. He became president after Harry Truman. He was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the only five-star general to become president of the United States. But all over the world, communism was trying to reach its hands into certain countries and influence those countries. You have Southeast Asia, the area, one country specifically, Vietnam, where the northern part of the country was considered to be communist, the southern part of the country practicing democratic ideals. And it wasn't until in the 1960s that we began to find out that North Vietnam, or I should say in the 1950s, that we found out that China and Russia were aiding North Vietnam before their invasion into South Vietnam. You have Eastern Europe, who is being ruled with an iron fist by the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin passed away and was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who stated that he wanted to have a different policy than Stalin. He actually wanted to have a good relationship with the United States. He visited the United States, becoming the first Soviet Union leader to visit the United States. But also one interesting thing is that even though he wanted to promote goodwill, there were several moments where we realized as Americans that the Soviet Union really had not changed under Khrushchev. In fact, there was a moment where he gave out a warning to the United States stating, "We will bury you." So things were still tense between the Soviet Union and America after Khrushchev's ascension to power. In Cuba, this is a big one. There were two main people vying for power. Cuba had been under control of the longtime dictator Fulgencio Batista, but there was a man by the name of Fidel Castro who led a revolution. And there were a lot of Americans who threw their support behind Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro claimed that he wanted Cuba to be better, that he would be a better leader than Batista. And a lot of Americans believed him and were openly supportive of Castro. However, whenever Castro took power, he was just as cruel, if not a worse dictator than Fulgencio Batista. He visited the United States, Castro did, was met by Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. And after their visit, when Castro left, people asked Nixon, what did you think of him? He said, "I think he needs to be watched." And Nixon was right, because it turns out that Castro had communist dealings with the Soviet Union. And once he took power, after a while, he openly declared that he was a communist. He condemned the United States. In fact, he once gave a speech at the United Nations where he railed against the United States, which is one of the things that I can't stand. The headquarters of the UN is here in the United States because it just gives dictators a platform to rail against us on our own soil. But anyway, he aligned himself with Nikita Khrushchev and started receiving aid, military and financial aid. This was very scary for the United States, because now communism and Russia now have an ally just across the Caribbean in Cuba. And if the Russians are able to send missiles and weapons to Cuba, that is within firing range of Washington, D.C. So this is very scary for the United States. Well, the election of 1960 was an interesting and historical one. John F. Kennedy, the Democrat, was running against Richard Nixon, the Republican, former vice president of Dwight Eisenhower, in the election of 1960. John F. Kennedy was 46 years old, I believe. No, 43 years old. He was also a Roman Catholic, which was a first. Well, not a first. There had been other Roman Catholics who had run for president. But he ends up becoming the first Roman Catholic president in the United States. Also, the youngest president elected in U.S. history. Theodore Roosevelt was actually younger when he became president, but he became president because William McKinley was shot. He was not elected. So JFK becomes the youngest president elected in U.S. history. Interesting thing about the election of 1960 is that it was the first televised presidential debate. And JFK wore TV makeup. He took the advice of his advisors, put on TV makeup, sat down. He was very energetic. And JFK, if you were to ask a lot of people at the time, he was young, he was good looking, he was energetic, and he was all-American. He was Harvard graduated, had a great accent. Whereas Richard Nixon was a little bit older, he did not wear the TV makeup. He looked a little bit unshaven and sweaty. And it was interesting because after the debate was over, there was a poll taken asking people who had listened to the debate on radio who they thought won, and then asking people who had watched the debate who they thought had won. The people who listened on the radio said they believed that Nixon won the debate concerning policies, whereas people who had watched on TV said that Kennedy won the debate. What this goes to show you is that Americans are completely and utterly vain and always side with the good looks whenever it comes to TV. It's terrible. I know, and it's shallow, but that's who Americans are and have been for quite some time. Very interesting. But that was an interesting poll. JFK ends up winning. John F. Kennedy, whenever I say JFK. And that ushers in the struggle for civil rights. I have posted 2 videos. One is of Martin Luther King Jr. biography there for him, and then another is about the sit-ins at Greensboro, North Carolina, about 4 students. And so we begin to see this massive movement started by African Americans to receive equal rights. Now, we mentioned earlier in this chapter that in the South, Jim Crow laws had been implemented, and Jim Crow laws, they effectively enforced segregation, meaning black people could not go to certain waiting rooms. They would not be served at certain restaurants. White people got more privilege than black people. And so it was a very difficult time for black people because even though under the Constitution, they were given rights, in real life, they never received those rights. And so here, with the sit-in Woolworth's department store in Greensboro, this is on page 493, there were 4 young black men who went into Woolworth's department store where black people were allowed to shop, but they weren't allowed to be served at the counter to eat. Well, they sat at that table, and the owner told them, I'm not going to serve you. But they just sat there until the end of the day. Second day, they came back. Third day, they came back. The protests were never violent, even though violence was shown toward them. This ended up spreading throughout the South, in Nashville, Tennessee, in other states as well. People began performing sit-ins, saying, we're going to sit here because we are not second-class citizens. We are human beings who deserve to be treated as such and be given our civil rights. And so it started there with the sit-ins. You had freedom riders who began protesting the segregation of the bus system, where Rosa Parks really played an important part in that. You had Martin Luther King Jr., a minister, who we've watched his I Have a Dream speech. He became the leader of the civil rights movement. You have the march through Selma, Alabama, into Birmingham as well, where people were marching for freedom, protesting peacefully. You had a lot of people doing what it took to achieve civil rights. Sadly, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, after giving a famous speech there. But the struggle for civil rights continued even after his death. Let's see, there was one more thing I wanted to talk about in this lecture, and that would be the space race. So in 1957, the Russians successfully launched Sputnik 1 into space. And Americans began to get worried. What's going to happen since they've beat us to space? What are they going to find up there, and how are they going to establish dominance in space? Well, when Kennedy became president, he said, I want to be the first country to put a man on the moon. And I think he said he wanted to do it at the end of the decade. So in 1960, he said, at the end of the decade, I want to put man on the moon. And so they created NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, where they began working on this goal to reach the moon. And so that starts the space race, which if you look on page 493, you can read that yellow box there. I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to read the letter from Birmingham excerpt, Birmingham jail, that was written by Martin Luther King Jr. And so that is where we're going to stop. We're going to pick up at the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy's assassination tomorrow. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care.